So it's good morning here from the UK, and delighted to be here, and thank you for attending wherever you are in the world. It's my pleasure this morning to share some of the work that I've been doing as part of my doctoral research. So my name is Di Swift. My day job is as director of a teacher training organisation here in the UK. I lead something called a SCIT, which is a school-centred teacher training programme. So when I'm talking about mentors or teacher educators, I'm talking about school-based rather than HEI-based colleagues, and there may be some discussion and debate that we want to have in relation to that later on. As Carl said, hopefully I've set up the session so that people can make connections with their own work, that you can participate, and please do interrupt or question as we go. But I also hope that I've timed things so that we can allow for a good 20 minutes or so discussion at the end of the session as well. So the title of the talk that I'm giving is Using Semantic Gravity to Challenge the Structuring of Professional Practice Knowledge. So in terms of the presentation this morning, or this afternoon, or wherever you are, so it's this morning in the UK if I use that time zone as I'm discussing things. So I'm going to assume that most people in the room have got some sort of working knowledge of semantic gravity. I am going to talk a little bit about what I mean about structuring. And I am going to talk a little bit about different conceptions of professional practice knowledge, and some of the ways that I've used semantic gravity to perhaps unsettle some conceptions of professional practice knowledge, and the potential gains that we can generate by using semantic gravity within that way.
Di, it might be just worth just asking if anybody doesn't know what semantic gravity means, just in
Thank
case.
you.
And it is not it's not like a shaming thing. If you don't know, that's fine. So if you don't know, just let us know now in chat or on the screen. I'm not sure if the thumbs up means you do know it. Only tell Di if you don't know.
Sorry, no, apologies. Just assuring. I'll keep quiet.
Thank you, Linda. That's great.
Well, if anybody doesn't know, you can just say, and we will just, we'll just divert into that and explain at any point.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Linda, and thanks everyone. And do just say. So this slide is just a sort of challenge to yourselves, really to try and make a connection. So in my thesis, the concepts of time and space become quite significant, but obviously we've only got a limited amount of time this morning. So I just wanted to make a connection for yourselves with these big ideas of time and space, and thinking about observing practices. And perhaps you could have in mind a time when you have observed practice. At a bit of a risk, if nothing comes to mind, then maybe you want to observe my practice during the presentation today. So when we observe practices, are we observing in clock time? So are we observing in the moment what we see? Or are we taking into account something called entanglements? And in terms of entanglements, I'm drawing on the notion from physics, a quantum notion. And the notion of entanglements is when two or more particles become connected so that they change each other, they alter each other, they're no longer independent of each other, even across vast distances. So that notion of distance gets us into that second concept, that concept of space. So again, when we observe a practice in whichever context, whatever field we're working in, or in relation perhaps to something that's very familiar with us, when we do that observation, are we simply observing in relation to the place that we're experiencing during the clock time, or do we think about how the spaces of others are present within that space, so are co-present within that space? So today, when you're observing me, are you observing me in whichever time zone you're in, minute by minute, using the clock time? Are you observing me in the physical space of the virtual room? or are you bringing in entanglements with others? And does it matter whether you are or not? And what matters? So I'm just going to park that, leave that as a challenge, maybe just leave that as something for you to think about and connect with during the presentation. And now I'm going to move into the detail of what I hope to be discussing and sharing with you today. So I'm going to go through a little bit about my own research context and the motivation for the research. So as I mentioned, I'm director of a school-based teacher training program. We deal with postgraduate students that are wanting to train to teach in England in the primary phase, so wanting to train to teach children age 5 to 11. So those beginning teachers were participants within my research, as were their school-based teacher educators. I'll share a little bit about the motivation for the research, and then, as I mentioned, looking at different ways of conceiving of professional practice knowledge, before then looking at my sites of data. And the sites of data were looking at the weekly development meetings, the weekly discussions, the dialogues that happen between a beginning teacher and a mentor. And so it was the dialogues that I analysed using semantic gravity. And interestingly, well, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The way that I used semantic gravity was using what I'm calling diffractive profiling. And again, that notion of diffraction comes from physics, and I'll talk a little bit more about why diffractive profiling and why I use semantic gravity in that way. And I'll share some examples of the profiles that I generated, the research data, and then how I used those profiles within the research itself before opening it up for the full discussion, but please do interrupt as we go. So for those of you who are familiar with semantic gravity, this is an attempt, and it is only an attempt, at a profile for the session and what I hope to do during the session. So there's a 4-part translation device that I used, and I'll share that in a little bit in a moment, and I've used those 4 parts. So we'll start off quite context dependent, my own research context. We'll then become more gravity light and think about a context concept connection, thinking about connections with concepts of professional knowledge, and before coming back to my own context again and these weekly development meetings, the dialogues that happened between 2 individuals, but perhaps also thinking about expanding the way that we think about those dialogues. And then going back up to perhaps exploring semantic gravity in a way that it can then transfer across different contexts, this notion of diffractive profiling. Is it helpful for you in your context? Is this something that's got legs? And perhaps we can have debate and discussion about that. And that debate and discussion will be informed by the data and the analysis. So as I mentioned, I used a 4-part translation device, thinking about the context, concept, connections. So if something were very context dependent, it was SG++. If there were some connections, SG+, and then moving up where there were more context independent concepts used, before it became very gravity light. One of the reasons for just sharing that translation device for you, just very briefly, and I know you'll be able to see the slides afterwards, and also if anybody wants to get in touch afterwards with any detail of anything or any further discussions, then please do get in touch. My email was at the beginning of the slides. But one of the reasons for just sort of briefly sharing that translation device with you very early on is because I want to make an invitation. And the invitation is maybe just to make a quick copy or take a photograph or a screen grab of this semantic wave of the session outline as it now is. So I'm just going to talk for a moment while you can see this slide on the screen so that you can jot down the wave. You don't maybe need to note the little call out boxes if you're hand drawing it. But obviously, if you're going to take a screen grab or a photograph, those little notes will appear there. So just try and make a note, because my invitation to you is, as we go, that blue wave, that blue profile is what I think I'm hoping to do during the session. As Carl said, we may or may not get that far. It depends on interruptions and discussions. And obviously, as I'm thinking, I might be making connections with other ideas that I think are relevant to you. So the blue line is what I think I might be doing. And then as we go, I'm going to pause at various moments and to give you the opportunity as we go to plot on the same profile how you're experiencing this session, and any connections. Are you with me? Have I lost you? Are you bringing other things to the session? Are you staying context dependent as I'm perhaps sharing concepts? Or are you thinking theoretically or thinking more context independently as I'm back in the context? So just that invitation that as we go to plot, to superimpose on the session outline the way that you feel that you're engaging with the session. And it is the way that you feel that you're engaging with the session in terms of the invitation today. So we're going to move now into the research context and motivation. And each time you see a slide like this will be the time to pause and to go back to your own profiling and just have a moment, perhaps thinking about how you're responding and engaging with that particular element of the session. So my own context, we're a SCIT, a school-centred teacher training provision of between 70 and 100 students. A big issue for us, as it is across the globe, but there are differences in the way that this is an issue across the globe, is about recruitment and retention in terms of the teacher workforce. And Chris Winch's work there highlights that in England, attrition rates are particularly high. Figures of 43% of our teachers leaving after 5 years. And that's a challenge for us. Folk who invest in training to teach, who invest in beginning their career, make the commitment to teaching, and then are leaving within the first 5 years of service. As I said, it's a global issue, and many of you will perhaps experience issues within your own education sector or within your own field. So recruitment and retention has perhaps got connections across different professions, different fields. But one of the things that I became curious about was this difference. And in 2017, that stark contrast with what was happening in another Northern European country, in Germany, where only 2% of teachers were leaving. So I wanted to get underneath those figures. Why the difference? What was happening in England that was maybe contributing to the recruitment and retention challenge, and could anything be done to ameliorate that? Some of the research that's been done within the English context. So officially, the government would cite workload. Workload has become a proxy, I think, for a myriad of issues that are being experienced within our professional field. So some more recent research suggests that actually one of the reasons and a significant reason as to why folk leave the profession is a lack of epistemic agency. So a lack of agency about knowledge and knowing, and a lack of autonomy. And again, I can quite happily go into more details about the English context if anyone's interested. But if anything, that lack has increased since 2019. Other research, interestingly, that's been done is that maybe this is teaching is a little bit different to some other professionals. in that teachers reported that they were less likely to have control over their job than similar professions. And again, I think some of the work that I've done is about what sort of profession is teaching, and what professional status does it have? And again, that question of does it matter? So within our context, we don't have a curriculum for teacher training. We do have a set of standards. These standards have been in existence for just over a decade, the teacher standards, and they are produced by the Department for Education. So this is a form of official knowledge, policy knowledge about what profession teaching is, and the standards that you need to reach in order to gain something called QTS, qualified teacher status. The standards, you can Google them, they're available in the public domain. There are 8 standards plus part 2, 8 standards, but with lots of bullet points. And so this articulation of our profession is quite atomized. As I said, these are a set of standards rather than a curriculum. It's up to providers to generate their own curriculum, but their curriculum must be compliant with these standards. These standards are the endpoint assessment of any period of teacher training. They're also the standards by which experienced teachers are held to account when you're going through promotions or pay walls in terms of salary increases. You need to demonstrate outcomes in relation to these standards. The standards are full of command words. So to demonstrate, they're outcome based. And when they were introduced, Michael Gove, the then Secretary of State for Education, he contextualized these standards in the pedagogy of observation. So watching others and being rigorously observed yourself is the best way to develop your professional knowledge. So he associated these standards with the pedagogy of observation and being observed. And that's a theme that is carried through the way that the profession is officially articulated. So Gove talked about teaching as a craft, being best learnt as an apprentice, observing a master craftsman or woman. So a particular articulation there of teaching as a craft, and also a particular articulation of craft knowledge there. And I'm using that word particular in a particular way, because not all folk would describe craft knowledge in that way. Teachers quite often talk about a craft knowledge, the craft of teaching. There is some research evidence that suggests that other professionals don't use the term craft in quite the same way. And again, you may want to make connections with your own field. That
Sorry,
theme
can I just ask?
Yep.
Can I just ask, does it say what they're supposed to be looking at? I mean, like, because Wittgenstein used to tell people to just go and stand around somebody and breathe the same air, which is about as helpful as saying watch somebody else. When, you know, I was just wondering, do they say anything about what you're supposed to be noting in the absolute chaos of the infinite data potential of the classroom? Classrooms are, Basil Bernstein used to say, classrooms are the graveyard of the researcher, because they are just so infinitely complex. He would add. Well, I would add to that. That was he did the pithy bit at the front.
Thanks, Carl, and a great question. So the majority of the way, or the way that the majority of providers have interpreted this, is that you observe in relation to those teacher standards, in relation to those outcome competency based statements, those that performative statement. Of course, what's underlying that is a very strong sort of neoliberal agenda, but you know, maybe we can save that for the discussion. The other great point that obviously you're raising there is the complexity of the classroom, and if we're observing in relation to those atomized standards, that could be interesting to explore as well, in terms of the direction of travel in terms of the observation there, and the way then that professional knowledge is articulated. So maybe to follow on, there's lots to get your teeth into in this statement as well, but it gives you some feel for the official context in which we're working. And these are terms that continue to be learned. They talk about our strongest schools. And again, there's quite a narrow measuring set used to describe the strongest schools, usually those schools graded by our inspection service as being at least good, if not outstanding. And our best teachers, and again, how do we measure the best teachers? But you can see 3 years later, that theme is continuing. And then 10 years later, the quote at the bottom, 2021, at the moment, teacher training in this country is in a probably, let me use the word, a state of chaos. And we've just been through a market review where we've all had to bid to make sure that we comply with the official documentation. So again, a lot to get your teeth into here. That increased school involvement in training recruitment. It's and paved the way for the close integration of theory and practice. And again, in the thesis, I get quite deep into theory and practice. We'll touch on it a little bit today. One of the things I end up talking about in the thesis is about a theory-practice relationship, recognizing the difference in those knowledges, but the connection, the entanglement of those forms of knowledge. But officially, our government is saying that it is schools rather than HEIs that are the institutions that enable a close, and they use the word integration. So again, it's interesting, do they mean conflation? Do they mean domination? What is it that they mean? And that is not well articulated within official documentation. So my research context is the skit. The motivation is, can we get underneath this recruitment and retention crisis? I've just shared the way that knowledge, professional knowledge, is officially articulated. So I want to move now to the way that the field, the pedagogic field, articulates professional practice. So lots of different conceptions, as I said, lots of different conceptions as a craft. Chris Winch's work, he's done a lot of work on the different ways that we articulate know-how and know-how to within a craft knowledge, and he articulates that the craft worker conception of teaching is one conception of teaching, and when we conceive of teaching in that way, our focus is on the skills or the techniques, acquiring those skills and techniques, and he says in a contextually relevant conditions. So we're not just performing a skill or technique, we're making it appropriate to the context that we're working in. So that conception's pretty close to the UK's, or I should say the English context, craft worker. The danger of that approach is that it could be reduced to the empirical element, to what is seen, rendering invisible or inert any reasons for the action. So it could be that we just go with what we see, tick, you've performed that skill, tick, you've performed that technique, well done, you become a teacher, without thinking about, was it contextually relevant? What is the reasoning? What is the judgment that lies behind the action that we could physically observe? And of course, what we can't observe are the thought processes that are going on, other than the way that they're materialized in the action. And the only way that we would know that they're materialized in the action is if we talk to the person. We can't know their why without having some other form of evaluation beyond the moment of the classroom, beyond the observation. The danger of that approach is if we don't have that dialogue and we are observing, then it's that mini me, copy me. I'm a successful teacher. I'm thought to be a really strong teacher. Copy me and you'll be fine. Tick. You've performed the skill or the technique that I've performed. And the pick your bricks bit is you pick the little bits the atomized skills and techniques, put them together, and a teacher you make. So that's one conception. A lot of that conception of that craft knowledge and the know-how to do a skill or technique perhaps is based on some interpretations of Ryle's work about know that and know how. But again, others would say that's one way of interpreting what Ryle said. And when Ryle talks about intelligent action, when we do something intelligently, we're simultaneously doing more than one thing. We're thinking and doing. So in that moment, there are both thought and actions, that they're in a relational form, and the nature of that relationship determines the form of the activity that we take. So if we only base our observation on the external, on what we see, and we're not having a dialogue in terms of what's being thought, then we've got a very, very partial understanding of what professional practice is. But of course, in the moment, we need other ways of getting into thought. And it might not be that we can get into thought in the moment in terms of that evaluation of the observation, but just because the evaluation of the observation happens at another time doesn't mean that it's a different type of knowledge. So Ryle's work is, our thought doesn't necessarily precede the moment of action. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
You can.
Why do we need to get a thought? Why do we need to know what someone's, why do we need to know what someone's thinking at the moment when they're doing it, which we won't get if we ask them afterwards?
Because we need to consider whether or not we need to get, well, yes, we'll step ahead of the tale a little bit, Carl. It depends how we conceive of a profession. If we're satisfied that a profession is about performing an action within the classroom, then we don't. If we conceive as a profession as something that is involves giving and receiving of reasons and engaging with bigger ideas that make us part of that bigger professional community, then we need to engage with a dialogue about thought so that we can engage that person with the professional community, and that person can contribute to the professional community and receive from the professional community. So if we are satisfied that a profession is about performing skills and techniques, we don't. If we conceive of a profession as being reason giving, then we do. Does that answer the question, Carl?
Sure.
So that I guess links us with that second quote there about those, if a profession is about accessing the collective concepts, those concepts that are context independent, that are gravity light, the systematic knowledge of a profession, then it's intelligent know-how rather than a know-how that is more about an everyday knowledge. So again, a contrast between intelligent know-how and know-how that is an everyday knowledge. So we've just begun to get into some of that grittiness about what is professional practice knowledge. And I've mentioned a couple of times then thinking about dialogue and the need to engage, therefore, in dialogue, perhaps to get underneath that. So in terms of where I think I'm going, I think we've gone a little bit gravity light in the discussion about professional practice. I think we're now going to go a little bit more context dependent in terms of thinking about the data sites that I used. But again, it's a moment for you to maybe just pause and think about how you're connecting with anything that I've said so far, and thinking about how you're superimposing your relationship with this presentation on the graph, on the profile. So moving on to the weekly development meetings, the reason that I chose weekly development meetings to look at A couple of reasons. One is that in the English context, there's something like 256 providers. Those providers are a mixture of HEIs and skits. Dan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking about Gravity Light, and I'm struggling to get my mind. It's still quite early in England, as we know. I'm trying to get my mind around what you mean by Gravity Light. Could you just give me an example, please?
Yeah, so Gravity Light would be a concept that could transfer across lots of different contexts. So thinking about I'm thinking about professional practice knowledge. So professional practice maybe is a big idea that can apply to lots of different contexts. It could apply to teaching, it could apply to medicine, it could apply to physiotherapy. So it's a concept that has got applications across a full range of well, not full range, but a range of contexts. Does that help, Dan?
Yeah, that's a brilliant example. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
So dialogue was chosen because all providers, whether they're school-based or whether they're HEI-based, are required to have some form of professional discussion. So it is recognised that in terms of developing an understanding of professional practice, that discussion or dialogue is important. In my research, I use the term teacher educator to represent the mentor, and beginning teacher BT to represent the mentee. One of the things that I found is that dialogue is very rarely analysed in terms of its knowledge structuring, in terms of its epistemological value. Dialogue is quite often analysed in terms of the knower, not the knower and the knowledge. So dialogue is quite often analysed in terms of the social relations. It's quite often analysed in terms of those relationships between two people, rather than the relationship between two people and their knowledges and the knowledges that they embody and carry with them. So given the fact that officially it was observation, given the insight that if you observe without having a dialogue, you're getting a very partial view, given the fact that dialogue is important, but that dialogue happens outside of the classroom, is that dialogue seen as being separate to classroom-based knowledge, or actually does it have a role to play within the actions that actually we see within the classroom? So what I was curious to know, because as director of the SCIT, I never get to see these weekly dialogues. We ask for them to take place, we ask for them to be reported, we ask for a form to be filled in to say these dialogues have taken place, we ask for some reflections, but I'd never actually seen or witnessed or heard directly what was actually happening within these weekly dialogues and the way that knowledge was structured within these weekly dialogues. So what I wanted to do in the research was get in to what was happening in those weekly dialogues, what type of discourse was happening. And that's where I drew on some of Basil Bernstein's work, particularly his work about discourse and the types of discourses, the types of ways that knowledge is structured. And Basil Bernstein differentiated between two forms, a horizontal form, which is time and space bound. So remember where we started, clock time, physical space, or entanglements. So Basil Bernstein says horizontal discourses are time and space bound, they're momentary, often associated with everyday or common sense knowledge, sometimes associated with craft knowledge, sometimes associated with craft knowledge. And again, we can perhaps have a discussion about that later on. So it goes back to Carl's question. If the professions are about non-common sense knowledge, if the professions are also about engaging with these big ideas that we can't see, then a horizontal discourse that is just about the time and space moment is perhaps insufficient. Those horizontal discourses, Bernstein says, can't be part of the second type of discourse that he talks about, can't be part of a vertical discourse. In a vertical discourse, then there is reference to the systematically principled knowledge structures. In a vertical discourse, there is reference to some of these gravity light concepts. And within vertical discourse, Bernstein differentiates between, and this is what I spent ages getting my head around, within this, he then differentiates between hierarchical and horizontal types of the vertical discourse. So a vertical discourse can be very hierarchical, and he talks about that being very specialised, or it can be in the nature of a horizontal form. So within those big ideas, there are connections between contexts in a horizontal knowledge structure form. So I really, in the thesis, I get underneath these two articulations of vertical discourse and think very carefully about these, because quite often it's been seen almost that a vertical discourse of a hierarchical type is where we should all be heading, this integration, whereas maybe a vertical discourse of a horizontal knowledge structure is a very powerful way of thinking about professional practice knowledge. We've got systematic knowledge in there, but we've also got context in there. So having engaged quite deeply with that theoretical perspective, I then needed a way to research this empirically. So there's a little bit of a clue here as to why now the connection, or I'm going to make the connection with semantic gravity. So a vertical discourse, a discourse that has access to systematic knowledge, but of a horizontal type, it can be strengthened if there is more access to systematic knowledge. So again, these types of discourse are not fixed, they're not there forever. There can be different forms of vertical discourse, but if we're just talking about a pure horizontal discourse, just isolated in the time and the moment, that is very different to a vertical discourse of a horizontal knowledge type. And a vertical discourse of a horizontal knowledge type involves this iterative moment between context and concept. And Bernstein referred to the notion of waves. And the size and the shape of the wave determines the properties. And Bernstein talked about, think of a carrier wave, and he uses, in his time, he uses the analogy of a hi-fi system, thinking about the tuner on a music system. The discourse or the wave, that determines what can be carried. So the shape of the wave, whether the shape, I'm stepping ahead of the tail, but let's do this, the shape of the profile, the shape of the wave, the shape of the semantic wave has an impact on what can be carried. So if it's a very shallow wave, it carries a different knowledge to if it's a more iterative wave or a steeper wave, a wave which is more vertical within its iterations.
Di,
yeah.
Can I just jump in there and say, like, he's not really talking about waves in the same way as semantic waves. He's using this as a metaphor for describing the relay of education and how education, if you change the relay, so basically a metaphor.
Yes.
It's like saying, if you change from a radio to a television, you've added in a totally different change. So he's basically saying the same thing as Marshall McLuhan, which is the medium is the message. And if you, or also a message, but what he isn't saying, we must watch out for this, because I've had this with linguistics where people have said, So semantic waves comes out of Fish's work in linguistics, because they've mentioned the word wave, not realizing that it means totally different. He's not talking about movements in the nature of the knowledge being transmitted. He's just saying that analogously to the way in which, you know, carrier waves, you get different things if you move them. So education is different if internally in terms of its structure of the very complex nature of the pedagogic device. And if you change that, you will get different outcomes.
Yeah.
But what you have to watch out for is retrospectively. Oh, hang on, I just need to. Uh-oh. Right. Got feedback then. Retrospectively implanting LCT back into Basel. We don't watch out.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful point, Carl, and maybe we can touch on that again.
My friend Rob did that, by the way. He did it a lot. He used to, Rob Moore, he used to do that a lot. So we would talk about something, and then he would go back and find it, read it into. So you get like semantic density, which has absolutely almost no corollary in any way to anything in Basel, except the very, 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 very occasional mention of like the difficulty of different forms of knowledge, like restricted and elaborated code. And then he went and found it in there, you know, and then kind of went, and it's in here. And the problem with that is simply that you could do that, keep going back. We can kind of shove Basel into Durkheim and then we keep going. And the problem is that when people go to Basel and they look for it, they can't find it. And then they apply stuff, you know, like wrongly. So I'm just saying, be careful about the use of that. He did not mean it in the way we use wave. And it is a metaphor.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. So to pick up on Carl's point there about the medium affects the message, I think that's something if we can hang on to in terms of where we're going next with this, and the medium of the dialogue affecting the way that professional knowledge is then carried and represented. So just to try and pull where we've got to so far together, different types of know-how as a skill or technique, perhaps analogous with that notion of teaching as a craft worker, which is one form of one way of representing professional knowledge. And in that form of knowledge that we're accessing some systematic concepts, but in a very weak way, using that notion of a weak grammar. The abstract concepts do not feature particularly strongly. It's a weak grammar. Craft worker is just one conception. So Cooley and Winch came up with a three-part typology, and it is a typology. So they've contrasted that with teachers who are in what they call executive technicians, teachers who've got a protocol, who follow that protocol in order to achieve something. So in the English context, for a while, we had the three-part lesson. Any lesson should have a starter, a main part, and a plenary. That would be an example of a protocol, and teachers following that protocol. So some engagement with concepts in that lessons need to be sequenced. So that notion of sequencing would be a big idea. You're not just performing the starter and performing the main part and performing the plenary. You are aware that lessons need to be sequenced. And then they contrast that with their terminology as a professional technician, where you need to give reasons or justified. So I varied I limited the time I spent on the starter because I could see the children were fidgety. Therefore, I wanted to move on. So in that case, the teacher's drawing on their pedagogic reasoning. They're able to give reasons. The teacher educator in the dialogue would be able to question them. There would be that exchange in relation to that concept, that big idea of pedagogy, being able to access some of the theory and thinking that lies behind the actions of teaching. So each of those types of professional knowledge or professional realization carries with them different ways of thinking about know-how, and carries with them different media, different mechanisms, different discourses in that. So I needed to research that. I needed to find out which media, which mechanisms were the teacher educators and beginning teachers using when they engaged in those weekly dialogues. Were they simply describing practice, clock dependent, space dependent, tick listy, describing what they saw, or were they getting underneath? Were they engaging in some of that reasoning and that exchange and that judgment? So that's why semantics, and as Carl said, though touched by Bernstein's framework, obviously, well, Carl's work and semantics, the semantic dimension of LCT, enables us to research empirically and think about what was happening in terms of these dialogues. How context dependent were they, or were they accessing any of those abstractions of knowledge? And some folk, of course, will be very familiar that within the semantic dimension are the two concepts, gravity and density. In my thesis, I just stuck to using semantic gravity because I was looking at, are things time and space bound to the school context, or do the teacher educators and beginning teachers bring into their dialogues and discussions any of this systematic knowledge, any of this specialising or organising knowledge that makes our profession more autonomous and gives professions agencies. So we're going to move straight on in now to sort of diffraction and diffractive profiling. So again, you may just want to be pausing for a moment and thinking about the way that you're engaging so far with that presentation. So diffraction comes from physics, and diffraction is about mapping the effects of difference, mapping the effects of interference. So one of the reasons that I drew on this is how does the teacher educator communicate professional knowledge? Is the teacher educator time and space bound? Are they focused on what they're observing? Or is the teacher educator accessing concepts? And it's not just about the teacher educator. What about the beginning teacher? How conscious is the beginning teacher? How explicit is the beginning teacher's knowledge? Is the beginning teacher already accessing some of those concepts? Some of our beginning teachers come with a lot of prior knowledge. So when I was interpreting the discourse diffractively, it was seeing about how the knowledge of the teacher educator and the knowledge of the beginning teacher, how did they interact? How did they entangle? How did they affect each other? What was the conception of professional knowledge that was being carried, and how was that being sustained? Because the argument is the media matters, the discourse matters, the way that professional practice is being conceived then has an effect on the pedagogy and the way that it continues to be conceived. So in this way, the discourse is part of the construction of professional knowledge. The discourse is part of the apparatus, it's part of the measurement. So if the discourse is flatlining, if the discourse is horizontal, if the discourse is time and space bound, then that has an impact on the way that we measure practice. So if it is, yes, I observe, yes, you've done that skill, tick, that's all how it will be. And that's limiting the beginning teacher's access to these specialising and organising contexts. Yeah.
Sorry, hi. I'm so interested to actually find out a little bit of exactly what you found out, because, you know, I think you've set up a very thorough background, But the work that Lynn Slanimsky and I've been doing on the mentoring conversations really shows us that the minute that the mentors go to a very specific incident in the lesson and talk about it, mentors or mentor teachers, suddenly they can go to principles, they can go to their craft. But when they just talk about, oh, this was nice and that was nice, kind of set at the level of the general, then the conversation doesn't go anywhere. And I'd be so interested to see whether those kind of patterns are actually, you know, manifesting in your data as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So I'll move on to that. I've got some graphs that will show you some profiles that hopefully illustrate that. So maybe just before I do that, I just want to draw on this bit in terms of the physics bit, and people may be aware of the particle wave duality. So just because you observe something as a particle doesn't mean it can also be a wave, and vice versa. So how we measure something helps determine how we see something. So this is maybe coming into some of what Lee was asking about. So discourse could be horizontal, could be that flat line, and in those cases that's about particular elements, atomized bits of practice. So we observe what happens in the classroom, the two slits, the concept, the context. If we just think in relation to the context, it's a low level flat line. If we just thought in relation to the concept, it's a high level flat line. There isn't the iterative movement that we're suggesting is a powerful movement in relation to professional practice, if professional practice is about reason giving. That could contrast with a shallow wave, where the context dominates, not very much in terms of the concepts. So that shallow wave, which could contrast again with a more iterative wave, a steeper wave, where we're looking at those recontextualizing principles, looking at the space of reasons, looking at that dialogic space. And then that very strongly hierarchical knowledge, which had been criticized in the English context of this was one of the arguments used as to why HEIs don't need to participate in teacher training, because they're the blob, they're too theoretical, not context dependent. So let's respond to sort of Lee's request now and move into sharing some of the research data. What did I find? So this is an example of what I've found, and this is an example of the diffractive profiling, which hopefully you're participating in now as well. Of when I profiled the dialogues, I didn't profile them as a single wave, but separated out the beginning teacher and the teacher educator to show the ways that they interfered, the ways that their knowledge entangled, and exactly the point that Lee was making, the way that the teacher educator responded or the way the beginning teacher responded changed the access and changed the way that professional knowledge was structured and structuring. So this was an example from a classroom where a beginning teacher was changing the groups, adjusting the groups. And at one level, it was that technical aspect about transition, about the way that they just managed the physical movement of the groups. But actually that physical movement of the groups was a pedagogic choice to engage the children differently. So the teacher educator, which is the single line, the beginning teacher, which is the dotted line, it's the teacher educator doing a lot of the talking, a lot of the analysis, no evidence that actually it's internally changing the way that the beginning teacher thinks about their practice. The teacher educator was simply describing, using some of these conceptual terms, but not checking in to see whether they were having any impact on the beginning teacher. In this example, it was interesting in that the beginning teacher, the dotted line, the beginning teacher was doing, started quite conceptually thinking about this notion of pupil progress. The teacher educator received that information, didn't do anything with it, didn't make connections between other contexts or other times they'd seen the beginning teacher do that work. They just received it. And in fact, that comment right at the end, you're pretty good at self-reflection. That's pretty much what I would have said. You've stolen my thunder. So in an interesting way, the teacher educator saw themselves as the sort of gatekeepers of the knowledge, theirs to impart rather than to engage in this iterative process of relating the specific classroom context to those bigger ideas and concepts. And then an example here of what I've called a restrictive profile, where the beginning teacher and teacher educator have referred to assessment as a big idea. They have referred to adaptive teaching as a big idea, but they refer in the text a lot to the teacher's standards, and that's restricted. They've not gone more gravity light because they've been constrained by the official articulation of teaching. They refer specifically to the standard. Yes, you've evidenced that, so let's move on, rather than having a professional dialogue in relation to what they'd seen within the classroom to extend and develop and enrich the knowledge. So those are just examples of the profiles that I generated. But what I didn't want to do was leave it there. So I took the profiles back to the beginning teachers and teacher educators to see whether my interpretation was an authentic interpretation and to see how they responded to those profiles. So sorry, apologies. Just before I move on, this is an example of one where the beginning teacher and teacher educator were more iterative, were accessing some of the specialising concepts more. So talking about differentiation, talking about enabling children to access the same lesson differently. They talked about differentiation. They then talked about specific examples from the classroom, then took that back up to differentiation, thought about lesson structure, thought about ability grouping, and then came back to the context. So what I found in the data sets were there were a variation of ways that the knowledge was presented.
Sorry, before you go on, Di, that was really fascinating. Can you just go back there? So what I'm really interested here is if they are not having some kind of university-based or formal teacher training or teacher preparation, where are they getting those concepts from to be able to do those kind of waving, you know? And I think that it's very similar in terms of the South African context, where an entire generation of teachers were just given a couple of classroom management tips and just put into the schools, go and learn on yourself. And they don't learn those kind of concepts through just being in a shared space. So where is that coming from? Is this particular mentor, got some sort of, what's different between this mentor and the other ones that were just kind of, oh, well, yeah, you've said everything that I wanted to say. What's the mechanism for the shifting in your analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I think it's a really good point. And that's what the research showed, was actually the beginning teacher's experience was very dependent on the navigational gaze, on the conception of the teacher educator, and how they saw professional knowledge, how they carried that professional knowledge. In terms of all these mentors were part of the skit where I'm director. We try and support the teacher educators in accessing some of the profession's key concepts. But I think your point is really important, because where I get to is if we've got a set of standards that continually atomize the profession, and in official documentation there isn't any reference to those big ideas, and we're moving to a more school-based system, then we are going to end up with those low or weak dialogues and discourses, and arguably that will weaken the profession. Whereas actually, if we are able to articulate as a profession those big concepts and those key ideas, and they make it into that official documentation, then we're more likely to challenge the articulation of practice. Is that okay, Lee, for the moment, in terms of a response to your question?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. The other thing that I just wanted to say in the previous example that you gave us, one of the students in our studies, the teachers were talking at a very much kind of low flat line, you know, just particular and present. And it was the student, the beginner teacher, who brought theory from university, though, and they were forcing this mentor teacher to go all over the semantic plane. We did density as well as gravity, but in every time that there's shifts around the plane, it was the beginner student, the beginner teacher who was driving those shifts. Whereas in your other example,
so this one, Lee, where
it seemed that the beginner teacher was trying to get there, and the mentor teacher, for some reason or another, didn't have the concepts or the language of practice to be able to take that further. It's almost like closing down opportunities for professional learning rather than opening them up.
Yeah,
and I found that very fascinating.
Yeah. So this one, Lee, exactly that. And you know, the issue is if it is all about observation and learning from our best teachers, if our best teachers have got a very reductive articulation of professional knowledge, then we're going to continually reduce the profession unless we're challenged. So I'm aware of time, and I just want to move on and share one more aspect of the research and then pause. So probably 3-4 more minutes, and then just open it up for a fuller discussion. So I kept going back to the profiles and tried to identify some of the big ideas that occurred across a number of the contexts, because in our context, our profession is currently defined by those atomized teacher standards rather than by big ideas, big concepts such as intervention or assessment or progress or differentiation. So this is language that came out of the analysis of the dialogues. So I'm just going to move on and share how I shared the analysis. So once I plotted the profiles, I took them back to the beginning teachers and teacher educators and said, you know, having used semantic profiling, this is what I think was going on. And there are now 3 lines on the graph because I needed to make visible my researcher influence. So I'm now part of the dialogue. So there are now 3 lines. And when I shared the profiles, the sharing of the profiles lifted the conversation. The teacher educators and beginning teachers said they hadn't previously thought of their discussions as knowledge structuring. They thought of their discussions. They actually, one of the participants used the words, we just thought we were having a chat, a conversation. They saw the discussions as separate to the professional knowledge that they realized in the classroom, rather than seeing the 2 engines that Ryle talked about being manifest as professional knowledge. They saw these as separate, and that separation of theory and practice, if you like, rather than relating theory and practice. It enabled them to have the big discussions about pedagogy. So one of the things we're wondering about is actually using semantic profiling as part of the way that we work with teacher educators, so that teacher educators then can be explicit that dialogues are about knowledge structuring, and the knowledge structure that the dialogues carry matters, makes a difference to the way that we structure knowledge. It wasn't without some concerns, because one of the teacher educators then sort of thought that those concepts could be buzzwords, could be like just a vocabulary list, and there's a danger there that the concepts then become a tick list rather than that iterative conversation. So the teacher educator was saying, I'll be there with my vocabulary list. Now I've got those buzzwords, and it's more how you put those concepts to work in relation to the context, that the buzzwords are not an end in themselves. So taking the profiles
that's such a good point, by the way. I've just got to jump in. That is such, you've got a general point that comes off the back of that, which is so important, is that particularly if you think about the wider context of this very binary dichotomous way of thinking, like I find that with discourses, by the way, but things like powerful knowledge and whatever is not powerful, and this very everyday academic kind of like these binary things. And then you're going to get this sense in which people go, oh, we just need to sprinkle in some technicality, like nuggets of chocolate into the ice cream or whatever, and then it'll be fine. And it's not. It is about the movements. It's about how does any of this theory get used to make sense of a concrete situation or experience or whatever, and then how that is kind of like reconnected up to the theory and back. And it's the movements that's so crucial, not just this, because everybody, well, we're trained to think in binaries and dichotomies. And so people think this, you know, so much of academia is based on animal farm, as far as I can tell, you know, of like, was it 2 legs good, 4 legs bad, or the other way around? But it's, you know, this good, that bad. Whereas we really, it's the movement. That's what you're saying. It's the movement. That is what's really key, is the transforming of knowledge through its connections, through that movement.
Yeah. And just to extend that, Carl, and it's the movement of all participants. And it's not, so that's what I found. If I plotted it as a single line, how do I know whether the beginning teacher's actually following the same profile as the teacher educator or vice versa, which is Lee's
no, definitely
point.
We could do one for every single person in a classroom, except they don't get to speak much, so we wouldn't see much. We would just see a little bit, you know, like each student would only have this little bit, because you can't assume that they've stayed the same when they're quiet.
Yeah.
So it would be a bit scatty, but we could do that for everybody. And I see nothing, I don't see why people, you know, why we don't, if we can.
Yeah. So this comes back to some of the points that we've begun to touch on. So one of the teacher educators was saying that the graphs made them look very differently. They're now looking not just at the classroom, but the bigger links, that as a consequence of seeing the profiles, they're more aware of what they discuss, that it gives them a structure, that they're no longer just thinking about the physical evidence, that they're thinking about the dialogues and the classroom together being different forms of evaluation of professional knowledge that connect together. So again, I relate it back in the thesis to that big idea of the navigational gaze, how we see our profession, and that the navigational gaze of the teacher educator, whether they see it as time and space and context dependent, or the connection or the flow, makes a huge difference. And going back to the dialogue that Lee stimulated a few moments ago, that if teaching's to secure its place as a profession, then teacher educators need to benefit from an awareness of the different forms that knowledge can take, the different ways that these forms interrelate, so that we gain or regain professional agency. So to go back where we started, we can then enable teachers to have that epistemic agency, and the theory is that they're therefore more likely to stay in the discussion, in the profession even. So moving ahead now, that's enough from me, and really it's time to open up for discussion. And whether anyone wants to hold up or share their profiles or use their profiles to stimulate dialogue. But thank you everybody for listening and for your participation and for what's going to come next. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Di. Just people just jump in. I don't like to be too formal. Any questions?
Hi.
Yeah,
This is
come
Dan
in.
from Stoke-on-Trent. I'll start the ball rolling. I'm going to go back to the very beginning. I liked a statement you made, which was the after observation discussion is actually still part of the observation. That never occurred to me. I think that's really interesting.
Thanks, Dan. I think that's a really important point, because I think what was happening was people were seeing the discussion either as everyday conversation, or the discussion was the theory bit and the classroom was the practice bit, whereas both are interrelated, that connection, that entanglement. And again, in the thesis, I go a bit more into town in terms of the nature of practice. So thank you for that, Dan.
No, thank you. That's made me think a lot today, that has. Thank you.
I like entanglement, but I have to say one thing that really does slightly trouble me is that we are stuffed by time's arrow. We can't remain, we don't remain entangled. So like, you know, we don't, you can't take the mentor away from the mentee and still have them influencing each other, like with new activities separate from each other that aren't reaching each other. So like the only thing I would say is I mean, I think it's fine to bring in a metaphor from somewhere else. That's great. But just watch out for the sort of person who's going to get really anal on you, because when semantic gravity first came out, people just misunderstood and thought I was just borrowing directly from physics and went, oh, but gravity doesn't work like that. And I was like, oh, God. You know, so just watch out for like people who get really anal about the use
I think
of
it's
words.
a good, yeah, I think it's a good point, Carl. What I say to students is, but I stay in your head. So when you're in a different classroom without me, it's if the teacher educator has opened up their minds to accessing that specialising and organising knowledge, they carry that with them embodied to a different time and space.
No, it's nice. Yeah, but a couple of people got their hands up. So Corinne.
Hi there. Sorry, you guys. You know, we have a thing called load shedding or brownout or blackout. So I'm on my phone, that's why. But I have switched this thing on now. Dan, I think, I mean, first of all, I really like the way in which you took us through this and encouraged us to map ourselves along the way. And I found myself that every time, as you were moving along, I was deliberately trying to lift it up to bigger, broader principles, other connections, transferring across. And I kept on thinking of our own context as academic developers. So in a sense, that's like teacher educators in the higher education space, and that's my role. And in our particular context, and Carl knows this well, at the university that I'm at, and in the region that I'm in, we have because we use LCT in our spaces explicitly, we have deliberately tried to build this cumulative wave in enabling these beginner teachers, in other words, these new lecturers, to connect the theory and practice, the theory being pedagogical theories or educational or sociology of education. And we've moved, I think we're running the risk of almost a high flat line of moving so far up that in their private moments, those new lecturers who are like the beginner teacher mentees you were talking about, asked me almost feeling ashamed, but what about the classroom practice in itself? You know, where do I stand when I talk? What tools and devices should I be using? How should I be using the whiteboard? And that was really interesting because, in other words, those are the kinds of conversations I have that are exactly what your whole research project is about, mapping. And we've seen the swing in the other way. And this was a beautiful reminder of our job of enabling the waving over time. So I just want to make that comment that I found this really inspiring to think about what you're doing in relation to what I've been experiencing in this space as a teacher educator for all intents and purposes in higher education. So thanks.
No, thank you. And I think it's certainly something that made, I think the diffractive profiling realised that you think you're carrying people with you, but are you? And how do you know? And having those plots as a resource to stimulate dialogue proved to be so incredibly powerful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
Guy, can I ask another question of something that you haven't touched on? So I've really been so interested to see how you know divided them out and showed the interaction and how making this visible really actually pushed the waves, and I think that that's really fantastic. What I'm interested in is, did you at all look at the focus of what was the substance of those conversations? So we've only looked at 8 conversations between mentors and mentees, but there's only one example in 8 conversations where the discussion focused on the way that particular knowledge concepts were being represented or mediated. The rest of it was about don't stand in front of the board, or don't use a green marker because the kids can't see it, or, you know, rather say this, or, you know, those sort of things. And very, very little of it actually got to knowledge mediation. It was more about, the conversations went more about the role of the teacher as a classroom manager. And I was wondering, how that's whether you have a look at that.
Yeah, I did, Lee, because when I so rather modestly, we call ourselves a scholarly skit, and when I looked at the first profiles, I was really disappointed because many of them were that lower flat line or a very shallow wave, and what it did was make us look at the way we structured the dialogue. So previously, our paperwork, if you like, for the dialogues was very tick listy. And so we've changed the framework for the dialogues and asked folk to discuss in relation to assessment. How's this session helped move on your understanding in terms of assessment? So we've in fact changed the way that we structure the course, and we've now got an A to E for the course of assessment, behaviour and communication, curriculum and subject knowledge, disciplined pedagogy and ethical professional behaviour. And that A to E, everything has to relate up to one or more of those A to E now, because we actually found the way the paperwork, the framing, the material that framed the dialogue, again, was an apparatus. And so it's a really important point about how you frame the dialogue as to then what happens within the dialogue. And that's a direct consequence of this research, that we wanted more waving. And we as a skit had actually restricted that. And that was a bit devastating when we found that out, but we've been able to respond.
That's really powerful. Thank you.
Anyone else want to jump in or ask a question or make a comment on anything at all? There is no limit, within reason. No. Where are you? Just remind me, where are you, Di?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit south of Dan. So I'm speaking to you from home at the moment, which is in Lichfield, which is about 20 so minutes north of Birmingham.
Very
but I'm doing my...
plus. But I meant, where are you doing your PhD? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Keele.
Keele University. Okay. And with whom?
Yes, I've been doing an educational doctorate, Carl. So I've been educating my supervisors about semantic gravity and social realism and Bernstein, but I have been supported by Richard, who's on the call. And, you know, this community, I mean, I just want to reiterate what you said at the beginning about this community and how welcoming they are, because I know I've really benefited from conversations with you, with Lee and her team, and from colleagues in South Africa. So attending these roundtables has helped me massively in my research. So a massive shout out to everybody on the call, really.
Oh yeah, this community is awesome. And just quick advert, we are having a face-to-face conference in January 2024, and it will be really about upskilling and bringing people way further into LCT as a way of thinking and so on. So it should be really cool. But I think you've got like something here, which one of the things I like most when I hear any research is that it actually means something. So, you know, that it's going to have an impact of some kind. I mean, not all research can, because there is like blue sky thinking research, although there is also intellectual masturbation as well. But I prefer things that, you know, have some sort of practical problem at the start and at the end, even if it doesn't reach it at the end, you know, because you can't only do so much in a thesis or whatever. And I think you can see the potential for this to have an impact. And I think that's really important. I mean, do not be put off. And people who know teacher education far better than me, like Lee, would know this more than anyone. But I would say don't be put off by the possibility that these sorts of things could end up being tick list style in the hands of someone, because everything can be in the hands of someone. It is a kind of a guerrilla warfare against people who like to be reductive, that we have to kind of maintain the struggle at all times against that. I mean, in the meantime, you know, the gains made by something like this could be quite fascinating, I think, for like, you know, teacher education and other forms, where, because there's not the only form in which people do stuff with other people and then chat about it. You know, you get that in a lot of things. You get that in law, in a lot of professional fields. You get, you know, not identical, but similar aspects of like the practice and the discussion as well. So I think that's really great. I think that's fantastic. And we've hit time perfectly. So I'm going to like bring us to a close and say thank you, Di. I hate this bit because it's so quiet, and it's nice to hear a round of applause properly. But thank you. There's my animation. Thank you, Di, for that. That's really fascinating. Thank you for everyone for being here, and for those who sort of pitched in and asked questions and made comments and so on. And as you said, feel free to contact Di directly, or put a thing up on the email forum. It's one of those spaces that's often quiet, but you know, people really, it is a great resource to be able to chat to people through it. And if people don't like stuff in their inbox, they can just hit the delete button, can't they? So it's, I think, you know, it's a great way of contacting, keeping in touch with people. We are increasingly atomized in the neoliberal university, and particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic. So I think it's very important that we maintain these virtual lines of communication at all times in between those moments when we can be face to face. So thanks, Di, and thanks everyone for being here. And I hope to see you all and more in 2 weeks for Brian, who is using another dimension of LCT, which is just such an awesome toolkit. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks so
thanks
much.